Why? Really simple.
This is really interesting. So Tucker Carlson.
God doesn't exist, but God is real. If there's a vacuum inside your brain that the concept of God can fill up, eventually left to people's own devices, people will fill up that vacuum with some kind of a notion of divinity or God.
Damn, girl, you get thicker.
Jesus Christ.
If you wake up one morning and you find yourself in a society where 23-year-olds with 4-year college degrees and like initiative who aren't smoking weed every day, if they can't make enough to buy a car, much less a home, much less get married, much less have children, then why should you be surprised when half of them say they prefer socialism?
Well,
you should not be surprised.
I agree to a certain extent. I think that the question is when the pedal hits the metal. Like you talk in the book about technology and how it's shifting and taking away jobs from folks. Yes. And you make specific reference to truck driving and the fact that there are going to be these automated cars on the roads. So would you, Tucker Carlson, be in favor of restrictions on the ability of trucking companies to use this sort of technology specifically to, sort of artificially maintain the number of jobs that are available in the trucking industry?
Are you joking? In a second. In a second. In other words, if I were president, when I say to DOT, to Department of Transportation, we're not letting driverless trucks on.
Oh, damn. No. Why do you think something is it's my NDI is lagging somehow.
It's on the road, period. Why?
The trucking actually maintain the number of jobs that are available in the trucking industry.
Are you joking? In a second. In a second. In other words, if I were president, when I say to DOT, to Department of Transportation, we're not letting driverless trucks on the road, period. Why? Really simple.
This is really interesting. So Tucker Carlson, I think is, if I had to guess, I'd say Tucker is a little bit closer to Steven Crowder than he is to Daily Wire. Like I would put him on the spectrum. Like if I don't know what the center of the Conservative Party is, or if I put like this is like the start of the Conservative Party, like it feels like you have like the Daily Wire is this kind of like very center right thing. It's probably the most sane part of the Conservative Party right now. And then you've got like Tucker Carlson is here, and then like right here you've got like Steven Crowder. This is kind of what it feels like. Tucker might be more extreme than Steven Crowder, and just haven't watched enough stuff of his recently, but this is like what it feels like. Like it feels like, yeah, this is what it feels like, but I'm not sure. I could be wrong, but let's see.
Trucks on the road, period. Why? Really simple.
So like Tucker Carlson has like this populist outlook here, right? Where he doesn't care about capitalism, or he doesn't care about the economy, or he doesn't care about reality. He just wants to be like hardcore protectionist. Like this is the guy where it's like sewing machines are invented, and he's like, well, if we make sewing machines, it's gonna put women weavers out of business. We can't have them, right?
Driving for a living is the single most common job for high school.
Isn't this several years old? Wait, is this clip years old? Is it really old?
Educated men in this country, in all 50 states. By the way, that's the same group whose wages have gone down by 11% over the past 30 years. The social cost of eliminating their jobs in a 10-year span, 5-year span, 30-year span is so high that it's not sustainable. So the greater good is protecting your citizens from, look, capitalism is the best economic system I can think of, I think that anyone's ever thought of, but that doesn't mean that it's a religion and everything about it is good.
No, but
there's no Nicene Creed of capitalism that I have to buy into. What I care about is living in a country where, decent
4 years old,
people can live happy lives, actually. And so, no, I would say immediately, no, are you joking? And I maybe would make up some pretext for public consumption, like, oh, they're dangerous. The technology is not quite finessed. No. But the truth would be, I don't want to put 10 million men out of work because you're going to have 10 million dead families, and the cascading effect from that will wreck your country.
So it's like, this is like a child's understanding of economics. It's like insane to me that like you could take like one semester of high school econ and realize like it's like lump of labor fallacy. It's just like such a stupid point that like new technology comes in and there's just X group of people will be unemployed because we ran out of work in society. Meanwhile, the United States is at like a 3% unemployment rate because we can't find enough people to work the jobs that already exist. Damn, and then that ends there. NYPD is setting up barricades outside Manhattan criminal court ahead of Trump arrest. Oh shit. Is Trump in New York? Do you think he'd try to like... Do you think he would try to leave the state? He came back to the state to be arrested. Proud Boy showed up in New York today, got no love from New Yorkers.
I came here to help people, not get the shit beat out of me. I have 2 other fucking buddies out. No, they put on a car. Where's your car? Get the fuck out of here. Get the fuck out of here. Fuck you people.
Have you had any Swedish food? Yeah, I go to IKEA all the time, bro.
Go! Yeah, get the fuck out of here! City, come back to Long Island, you
I kind of want to build out a picture of the world for you. It's a little bit of a jigsaw. I want to put the jigsaw pieces together first. Tell me what you think of it. If I said to you, numbers don't exist, but numbers are real, how would you parse that statement?
If you would say numbers don't exist, but numbers are real, then I would imagine that that what you mean is that like numbers are some sort of like arrangement of things that humans kind of create. They don't exist in the world. It's a pattern that we kind of say exists. But when you say they're real, you might mean that there is some real descriptive power to them describing reality. So for instance, the number 1 and the number 2 are not real things. But if I were to say 1 + 1 = 2, like if I have 1 banana and then 1 more banana and I put it together, I have 2 bananas, that's like a real phenomenon, I guess, something like that.
Yeah, so they don't exist, but not only do they describe the world, but in a sense, based on how well we manipulate numbers, they can affect the world. Would you be able to similarly parse the following statement? God doesn't exist, but God is real.
Yeah, it could be, sure.
There's something about being human that has some sort of an intrinsic proclivity for some notion of God, divinity, sanctity. If there's a vacuum inside your brain that the concept of God can fill up, eventually left to people's own devices, people will fill up that vacuum with some kind of a notion of divinity or God.
Possibly, sure.
This doesn't mean we're all born with the concept of God. It's more like God emerges from the interactions of culture, language, hierarchy, things we don't understand. But I've been trying to think of like why it's so universal. So in marketing, there's a concept called brand territory. You know, marketers look at customer minds as like there's a lot of association space inside people's brains. Concepts that are associated to each other tend to kind of cluster together. For example, cluster of concepts might be like liberal politics, political commentators, and a streamer who goes by Destiny. So if you're a liberal who regularly watches political content online, you're also more likely going to relate to Destiny the streamer. This association space is kind of like a mental real estate that everyone has. And there's 2 kind of like association space. There's mapped association space and unmapped, or like you can think of it as like the fog of war kind of association space.
Okay.
When was the last time that, say, you were using a product from a particular brand and you switched over to a competing product from a different brand?
I don't know. I'm sure it's happened. I don't know if I can think of anything off the top of my head, but why? Or I mean, like maybe when I buy like a new keyboard or something, but...
The reason I bring it up is like mapped association spaces are mental real estate where some brand or concept is already squatting. But the fact that some brand has a hold on that particular space in your head doesn't mean it can get complacent, because there are other brands constantly trying to move into that territory, right?
Okay.
So like Adidas wants into Nike's territory, or Wash wants into Destiny's territory. You may probably want a little bit into Hassan's territory. And whether you know it or not, your mapped association space is like in a state of constant war, and usually also a state of like constant stalemate, because the mental real estate market does tend to settle down over time as brands prove themselves. That's happening. The other kind of association space, the unmapped one, do you have an idea of where you might look for if you wanted to find unmapped association space?
What would you look for if you were looking for unmapped association space? I have no idea.
So there's like the mental real estate that's lying unoccupied by any brand or idea because no one knows it exists.
Yeah, it would have to be some totally new but I feel like with the internet and everything, I feel like we're inundated with so much shit. I can't think of anything. Yeah. Well, maybe right now, I guess for newer generations of people that are a-religious, I mean, it may be religious space, sure.
So every new generation is its own huge, like, unmapped association space because they haven't had time to solidify their identities yet and the brands that they identify with, right? Yeah, right? Like, the most intense example I can think of was, like, I used to play video games as a kid. I'm sure you did, but I didn't really think of video games as, like, narrative-driven until Final Fantasy VII kind of arrived on the PlayStation 1. And suddenly, like, Final Fantasy dominated the narrative video game RPG market that no one ever knew existed until it arrived, right?
Sure.
So, now when it comes to new generations, kids, these are like the most fertile kind of unmapped association space. They're undefended, they're uncontested, they're super suggestible, and it's kind of fucking hilarious to me that when we talk about society and culture and all that, we kind of casually make distinctions between boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, zoomers, as if this was like a natural way to stratify and categorize people. And the hilarious part is almost no one seems to acknowledge that that whole categorization started as marketing terms. It started because advertisers needed to optimize for like different population groups. And they came to realize it wasn't just enough to target people by age, you had to target them by cultural generations, right?
Sure.
So now let's go into religion. Over the dawn of civilization, people discovered God, discovered religion, and because there was unmapped real estate where a concept like God could easily grow and establish itself, it basically did, especially because the early civilizations were like so isolated from each other. So the different gods, as far as I know, weren't really like competing, you know, unless maybe, and if you had like a pantheon of type of god like the Greeks or the Hindus did, then it wasn't a competition as much as just like stratification, but everybody bought into the fact that there was like this one single pantheon that explained everything. And when it left unchallenged, this concept of godhood basically became like a core, intrinsic, immutable part of your identity and how you view the world. And this happened over the course of centuries. So then if I ask you, how did something like that was this strongly built into the culture around the world, why do you think it began to fade over the last century and a half or so?
Well, let's see. So you're saying that concept of God, a heavy part of our space, why did it start to fade? Going by what you've spoken to me so far about, maybe I would say maybe because nobody's competing as much for that space once it starts to fade. Although I feel like Islam has started to do that a little bit. I'm not sure why.
Okay, so my theory is, the concept of God basically became too big for itself, too big to serve. It was basically so integrated into every part of society, especially what it meant to have a functioning society. That when I think I'm just pulling this straight out of my ass.
We call it. You can just say conjecture. That's a smart way of saying it.
Conjecture, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I feel like pulling it out of my ass feels more honest.
Sure.
So, I think it was a little bit the fact that people saw that there were other religions with their own gods who were doing just fine. So the first thing was, hey, apparently our version of sanctity isn't the only one that works. And that's what started the initial troubles with it. The second part was, I think, the arrival of the middle class as a distinct demographic group. Like, you've said this like a billion times, I think, as people got richer, they began to realize that you didn't actually need God to be a good person, to follow your dreams, to meditate, to build and raise a family. You kind of just needed like good public infrastructure, good personal interrelationships, good health, good education. And I won't say that that killed this like, abundant adherence and like of God. Like I won't say it killed the notion of God, but that notion began to seem optional.
Sure.
And a lot of people began opting out. So you got your atheists and agnostics.
And then your weak Christians and your weak Muslims, like people that are kind of
Yes.
faithful, but it's really just like a cultural thing that God's space is kind of not being occupied as much anymore.
Exactly. In your head, that God space is like now only partially occupied, maybe throughout the year, maybe during festivals or like particularly intense life events. You think you turn to God, but for the most part, you tend to go on without it. The problem is, especially with atheists and agnostics, I will say I am kind of mostly an atheist. You can say all you want that you don't need God, and maybe you don't. And that's why you evicted God from that mental real estate. I'm just going to call it the divine real estate, I'm not talking about God, I'm just talking about the space
That part of
God has
your
in your head.
Yeah.
So maybe you evicted God from that divine real estate, but that doesn't mean that you demolished the real estate itself, right? I have a feeling that if you don't fill that divine real estate where God used to live with something else of your choosing, then it's going to be filled with something else not of your choosing. Like, I feel like every single one of you, like non-religious people listening, there is in your head an unoccupied divine real estate that almost creates like a vacuum that other ideas and concepts are always going to try to fill. And whether you acknowledge it or not, there is a non-zero chance that you will someday eventually end up filling it with something that will potentially radicalize you. What do you think that looks like? Stuff that, replaces God in that real estate?
It's probably some like overarching, guiding, spiritual or purpose-driven thing. That like that there's something in life that gives you like purpose and meaning. Like so, like questions of like why are we here and what are we here for? These are things that are largely spiritually driven or were largely spiritually driven, and without God, that space just ends up becoming kind of empty. And I guess as an atheist, you don't readily fill that space. That requires like a great deal of like actual deliberate thought to do so. A lot of people probably haven't.
One, it requires a lot of actual deliberate thought to do so, but the other thing is like even knowing that it is a space that needs to be filled in the first place. That to just acknowledge that, I feel like most people aren't aware that space exists in their head. So usually you end up filling it with stuff like, ethno-nationalism or, Hitler's pure Aryan race or a communist utopia. And even if you're like personally immune to this, even if you can personally put like a giant not for sale sign in front of your divine real estate and continue to function like a normal human being, that doesn't mean everyone else can do that. In fact, I don't think most people can. I think most people will want, over the course of their lives, to fill that real estate with something else, whether they know it or not. And that's especially true if you have kids. I feel like it always used to bugger my mind. I used to hear about, immigrant families who tend to be kind of like loosely religious or mostly agnostic atheist, and they go to a different country and their kids grow up and they grow up feeling alienated in that country. So that kid looks to the spiritual or religious tenets of their home, like the parents' home country.
Wait, who just told me this? Was this an Austrian conversation? I either had an Austrian conversation with Farah or I was talking to somebody else who
I think
said
that you were talking to Richard Spencer, probably.
Did Spencer say this? I feel like I spoke to somebody. I feel like I spoke to somebody off stream personally about their family.
Off stream, I wouldn't know. Of course.
Yeah, where somebody spoke about their parents when they came to the United States, they got more religious. Was it a caller? Maybe it was a caller. I don't remember. I feel like I've had a conversation with this recently with somebody, like a personal conversation. I don't think it was Spencer, but I don't remember. But go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I like everything I'm saying now. It kind of like got triggered by your conversation with.
Oh,
Spencer.
sure, yeah.
Yeah. So most people aren't keeping that giant not for sale sign up in front of your divine real estate. That's especially true of your kids. And if you don't help your kids fill that divine real estate with something of their choosing, then you're leaving it open for someone or something else to fill it. And that's how kids tend to get radicalized. And it's a coin toss on whether that someone or something else is like good or bad. And when it goes bad, it goes really, really bad. Now, before Spencer, there was actually a different trigger for this conversation that had me thinking about this for almost like the last year. And that was you were on a panel, I think early last year, around this time, with Nick Fuentes and Infrahas. And you were talking like, I think Kanye and some other shit. But at the end of the call, you said something interesting, and that it was kind of nice how Fuentes and Infrahas had this whole grand narrative thing going on.
Yeah.
That was all encompassing. It addressed every part of society, every part of the human experience, gave answers to the most common hard questions. And the fact that they're terrible answers doesn't matter. The point is, those answers fit together very nicely. That's what makes them so compelling. Right?
Yeah.
And they're also compelling because one of the major functions of the concept of God and religion is like a societal anchor.
Yeah.
It's a thing you all gather around. It's a thing you all try to aspire to. It's the thing you return to when things get scary. It's what do you call it? It's a congregation point.
Yeah.
If you want to try and build a grand narrative that can keep out competing toxic grand narratives, I think you need to understand the building blocks of grand narratives. Because I listened to your conversation with Richard Spencer, and you were talking about how pissed you were that it was some kind of social taboo these days to get hyped up about the cool shit that USA does. And I felt you so fucking hard, because that's how I feel about the progress of humanity in general. Like, if you're going to define God as omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, going everywhere, being all powerful, knowing everything, then okay, there's one thing to look at, like, the progress we've made technologically, scientifically, socially, philosophically as a species over the last like 3,500, maybe 12,000 years. But there's some other facts. Like, if I ask someone to look at the coldest place in the universe, with the background temperature of the universe is like 3 degrees Kelvin above absolute zero, but that's not the coldest place in the universe. The coldest place in the universe is in the University of Kyoto in Japan, where they cooled matter down to a billionth of a degree above absolute zero, and that means interstellar space is literally 3 billion times hotter than that.
Okay.
The hottest place in the universe isn't at like the core of some like neutron star, which is like around 100 billion Kelvin. The hottest place is like Brookhaven National Lab, and it's in New York. But these guys basically collided gold atoms together to achieve a temperature of around 4 trillion Kelvin,
Okay.
which is about 40 times hotter than a neutron star. So there's other facts, like in the last 80 years of history have been like the longest peace we've known, I think, in human history. Where like no two major world powers have gone to war with each other. Most of humanity was historically with smallpox, like a disease that probably killed, I think, more people in history than anything else. And we eradicated that bitch in the last, I think, 50 years.
Well, yeah, we had. I don't know if it's coming back now, but yeah.
Smallpox? Nah.
Yeah, I thought, weren't there a couple? Or no, I might be thinking of measles. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're
United
talking.
States. Yeah.
That's measles. We didn't eradicate measles. We only eradicated 2 of them, but one of them, I think, killed more people than anything else ever have. So that bitch is dead, and we got reusable rockets, probably getting closer and closer to an AGI. I know they keep saying that sustainable nuclear fusion is only a decade away, but it's like.
Although they're getting closer. It seems like they are making progress. Yeah.
They are making progress. So like, I think when they say it's only a decade away, is that they underestimate how much work there is still left to be done. But every time they figure out what they underestimated, they get a better picture of how close they are, and they are closer. And that fucks with me that we've basically managed to command so much of nature and overcome our limitations physically.
Here's a question. I'm curious if you've thought
Yeah.
about this before. When it comes to physics, when I used to be a little bit more digging into this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
so here's something that would be kind of depressing and is a little bit scary. What if we actually have solved essentially like the majority of physics? There's still like a couple of like small loose ends to tie up, like reconciling gravity and QM, although we've got kind of working models for some of this. What if we figured out most stuff and this is kind of it? Like there is really no getting off of this planet. There is no like faster than light travel or teleportation. We have like a pretty good working understanding of the universe, and we're basically at the bounds of our knowledge of physics. All we can do is kind of like iterate and refine on small engineering designs at this point. But for the most part, we've got most of it figured out.
Sorry, what was your question?
Like, if that was the case, it seems like that puts us like out of the bounds of being able to solve things in terms of like
that would suck, but I can't say definitively. I don't think anybody can that is the case, right?
Sure. But I'm thinking of like, when was the last when was the last big breakthrough in physics? Do you know?
The last big breakthrough, I mean,
because I feel like all of our breakthroughs have been like in engineering at this point, but in terms of like actual knowledge of physics, I don't know if we've like shattered anything. Like the last big thing I can think of was the Higgs boson, which people are putting in chat, but that wasn't a breakthrough. That was just confirming the models that we'd already like mathematically arrived at.
Okay, in terms of like, okay, I don't know what, I can't remember what the last big breakthrough was. The last awesome confirmation of our existing models, I think, was like the last year's Nobel Prize for physics, where, you know what? I'll come back to the Nobel Prize in physics if you want me to. It's like really cool, but I don't want to get. I want to answer your question first.
Sure. Yeah.
There are like a couple of problems to answer the question. First, there's the expansion rate of the universe.
Yep.
We know the universe is expanding and it's accelerating, but there's a problem with what the measurement of that expansion is supposed to be. There's one measurement, I forget the specific names of the two different methods used to measure this, but the first one measures an expansion rate of about 64 or 67 meters per second for every megaparsec.
Okay.
And the other one is, I think, 74 kilometers per second for every megaparsec. And the problem is, these two numbers shouldn't be different. You're both measuring the same thing. You're using different techniques, but every improvement upon each technique to measure it, or to measure the expansion, gets more and more divergent. Like the answers get more and more divergent from each other rather than converging to a single point. So I feel like whatever breakthrough has to come next will probably be there. The other breakthrough will probably be is in sense of why do we exist at all? Like when the universe was created, why wasn't there an equal amount of matter and antimatter? And like where has all the antimatter gone such that all of this matter that we are is allowed to exist? Like that would probably be a breakthrough. I'd like to think that we have good answers over there. But say I accept your premise that we have figured out all of it, and there really is not much to achieve or unlock other than engineering successes. I still think it would be really fucking sad if we didn't try our best to actually figure out whether or not the heat death of the universe was the inevitable end of the universe. I feel like that's a question that should not be left unanswered. And if the heat death is inevitable, I'm going to go ahead and say we should become God and remake reality.
Okay.
Because so to come back to what I was saying, my grand narrative is like, if you look at human history, we have been getting more and more omnipresent, more and more omnipotent and omniscient. I don't see an indication right now necessarily that we're going to slow down, especially if like promises of AI end up playing out without killing us all. And the way I like to put it is, if you I know the Abrahamic religions describe humanity as having been made by God in God's own image, and I think they have it reversed. I feel like it's God that's going to be made in humanity's image. If we play our cards, then there's only a small chance of it. There is a chance. And I think that's what we've got to strive for.
Okay.
And now, building blocks. I think at the very least, this was my grand narrative. So at the very least, if you personally want to maybe try and offer people a good grand narrative that can compete with like other toxic grand narratives, the type being sold by Fuentes and Haas. Here are some technical requirements I think a good grand narrative needs to fulfill. Right? Each one of these is technically a whole conversation unto themselves, and maybe we can chat about it in future callings. I don't want to get into the weeds just yet. Just tell me quickly what you think about it. Right?
Okay, go for it.
Okay. I think first, you need to place the people who might like you or like your narrative in an appropriate historical context, in the sense of where we came from, where we are, where we're going. If you want to call it a grand narrative, I think there actually does have to be a narrative. Like in mine, humanity is going through an extended hero's journey as a species to eventually become God. The second one would be a set of morality and ethics that is compatible with group living, and also of like multiple groups living together in proximity, something that kind of restrains destructive and violent behaviors. Because you can sell all the grand narrative you like, but if you don't restrain that violence that people tend to turn to in the absence of a good grand narrative, you're going to end up marginalizing your own movement.
Okay.
I think you need some way to explain, and I feel like this is the one you don't give a shit about. I think you need some way to explain the concept of and consequences of death, what it means that we're all going to die, the good and bad of it. Because I feel like you do an incredible amount of good work in terms of breaking down philosophies, in terms of like, having your principles, living up to them, differentiating between what makes like you do excellent work. I also feel like a part of the reason you are not maybe as big as I feel like you should be is because you don't address the death part. People are scared of death. Like whether whether they admit it or not, or you admit it or not, eventually somebody is like, gets like into this whole existential angst, and they're like, fuck, I'm gonna die, and I don't want my life to have meant nothing. And if you don't deal with the fact that you're going to die, that people around you are going to die, then another grand narrative that actually does confront death, even if that narrative is worse than yours, it's going to win out over you.
I'll keep this in mind, yeah.
You also need rituals, birthday parties, funerals, weddings, coming of age ceremonies, anniversaries, public holidays. You especially need rituals, I think, related to death. I think you need rituals related to sex. Sex is, I think, another part where the whole narrative falls apart if your grand narrative doesn't address the romantic aspects of people's lives. Because it's too, like death, it's too visceral of an experience to go unaddressed. And something else, like fundamentalist religion that says sex is so great, you can't have it, that still feels a lot more meaningful than a narrative that doesn't give a fuck about sex. And I feel like in my narrative, I'd say people should be having as many kids as the Earth can sustain, and once we're off the planet, as many kids as possible, so we can generate more brilliant minds who can solve the problem of becoming God. I feel like that's how sex would play into my narrative.
Okay.
But you talk a lot about good relationships, and you talk a lot about what makes for like good sexual dynamics, but I feel like most of your conversations about that tend to be pragmatic rather than spiritual / philosophical. I could be wrong about this, but that's the impression I have.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Okay.
You'd need some kind of, so the sixth thing you'd need would be some kind of like local organization or infrastructure that people can gather and organize around on a regular basis. You need this at the individual level, at the family and friends level, and at the neighborhood and community level. And before, I think it was pretty much just like churches, temples, and mosques that used to fulfill that role. And you said a billion times that it's weird we haven't found something to replace it with. But I feel like there is one institution that can easily replace it. That's everywhere. You want to take a guess as to what that is?
School?
Exactly.
Okay.
Like, I don't understand why every single function that you went to the church, temple, or mosque to perform that was, that revolved around the community coming together in solidarity so that you could protect each other and help out people in trouble and like talk about your hopes and dreams and aspirations. Every single one of those things applies to school. I think it applies to schools more than it ever did to churches or temples or mosques. I don't understand how that transition hasn't happened naturally already, especially in US where everybody
where
is
the
like,
schools are huge and our schools have like 50 million different things that happen inside of the schools.
Yeah, and the way again, this was like one of your gripes, but the schools tend to be tax funded by district, right? You're literally paying already into the coffers of an institution by district. Why can't the entire district just naturally congregate around it? It actually fucks with my head. I don't understand how this hasn't happened already.
Sure. Yeah, I understand.
And I think finally you need some kind of like symbols culturally to tie it together. And I'm not talking about just like a logo. I mean, logos are nice, but you need stories and music and art, something that is either born of the grand narrative or contributes to it and also captures the narrative and indicates some sort of like, oh, here's a potential future direction that this narrative might go in. Like, you need art and culture that engages in a vibrant way with the narrative. I think my favorite movie of all time right now, Everything Everywhere All at Once, is an excellent jumping off point for my kind of grand narrative. If you just want to talk about potential of the multiverse and everything you could do, your unrealized potentials and how you have to relate to your family and blah 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 blah, being kind and etc. I feel like if you want a good grand narrative to sell to people, you need to be able to give them a library of yours. Like, here's some movies you should read. Here's some books that have already been written that you should read. Here's some music you should be listening to, because I mean, obviously the church has like the Bible and all of the hymns and everything, but even people like what's his name, Fuentes. Fuentes can refer to different books. Richard Spencer tends to refer to a lot of different books, movies that they like. They have a particular bent to the kind of art and culture that they like talking about, and versus the type that don't. If you don't have that, you kind of it's not as sexy. That's basically it. Without good art, your narrative just isn't sexy enough to sell.
Sure.
So those are like the technical requirements. Now you have, I think, also emotional requirements that a grand narrative needs to fulfill. You've done shrooms, right?
Yep.
So that perception of like the self that dissolving or time becoming meaningless, like the ego death.
Yeah, if you do too much, yeah.
Yeah. So shrooms are not the only way that happens. People have those as like when they have like bouts of spiritual ecstasy, whatever causes it. It doesn't matter what causes it, but when they have it, they're very vulnerable in that time to being affected by whatever narrative they've been exposed to in the recent past. Whatever's been like looming the largest over their lives. Your narrative, I think, would need to account for that. That emotional fear / awe. This feeling might represent itself as different. Ego death is one way to put it, but there's also like a feeling of like you're one with the universe. What was that guy who Mr. Girl was arguing with? Glink, yeah. Or Glink. He was going on and on about his he did shrooms, and then he had the oneness of the universe, and that's all he wanted to talk about. I feel like Glink, I know the power of the experience he had. He just didn't have all these other elements of the whatever he was selling in place. And I think sex also ties into here again too. You know, really good sex can be spiritual, and but most importantly, I think you have to have people become creative in some way. I mean, creative is basically like whether it could be a handicraft, or maybe you're really into decorating your room, or you have art, or some kind of sick program you coded, or some research you did in public. You created something. Doesn't matter what that thing is, but there is something beautiful about creating something. The act of creating something, because you've talked about the satisfaction that comes after after you've finished a good book and you've closed it, and it's very different from the very transient dopamine hits you get from like scrolling TikTok.
Yeah.
I think that satisfaction is infinitely more intense when, instead of just passively consuming a book written by someone else, is something that you've personally created.
Okay.
And the final point is that I don't think you should call it God. I mean, your grand narrative, if there is like a spiritual component to it.
Okay.
I feel like you said that when you define perfection, when you've decided that you're perfect, probably like Mr. Girl has, you sacrifice all future growth. I feel like that's something people do when they call their ultimate spiritual aspiration God, because God is you can put the word God into a box. You can define it, you can define its bounds. I mean, if you say those bounds are unlimited, and you can say these are all the things that are irrevocably associated to it, and every time you add something irrevocable to the God box, you kind of limit it. And I feel like if you, instead of calling it God, you just called it, not even capital it, like, lowercase it. So you could still talk about it in the sense of like somebody creates a really cool project and you're like, that's it. Whatever that thing that you were chasing was, that's it. You've got it now. And people have that experience often enough, I think, that you could sell that. And I don't think you should ever try to formalize what that grand narrative looks like personally for someone else. Because I do think it's a deeply personal exploration, and if you end up like stamping out somebody else's expression of their grand narrative and replacing it with your own, I think historically that just tends to work out not well. I think you should curate people in your life who you feel like are also looking for it, whatever it looks like for them. Because there's definitely like people who I feel like are way more alive because they're aspiring to something, than people who basically just aspire to nothing. And I think the seventh rule would be you have to take full responsibility and accountability for how you want to express it and the consequences of that expression. No more, no less.
Gotcha. Okay. If I ever start my own religion, I'll come back and keep all these things in mind, okay?